Hello, I would like to make some comments in response to a series of tweets posted by Stephen Knight at Gspellchecker, that's Godless Spellchecker, last week. Godless Spellchecker watched Russell Brand interviewing Dr. Jordan Peterson, and in response made a few comments, briefly expressing his scepticism towards Peterson's answers to some of the questions, and his general feelings towards Peterson's shtick as a whole. I'm going to go through each of the half-dozen tweets and attempt to shed some light on what I think Godless Spellchecker missed. The nature of these responses could be uncharitably dismissed as me just saying, "Duh, you just don't get it," which is pretty much what my tweeted response might have looked like. So I thought it might be a good idea to go to a little more trouble and make a more useful response. Having said that, the TLDR of my response is that the primary reason for the general atheist dismissal of Peterson is a failure of their imagination. The secondary is their inability to adapt their views to something genuinely new. Now, I've followed Godless Spellchecker for years and have a great deal of admiration for his work, particularly his interviews. So I apologise if any of my comments here come across as a bit harsh, and I mean them only to be taken in a spirit of friendly sparring. It feels a little bit like I'm responding to my former self, as my own views on religion used to overlap with Stephen Knight's almost perfectly, and I can hear myself from a couple of years ago making the same comments that Stephen Knight makes here. So where I sound the harshest, it's where I'm speaking the most directly to my former self. I'm just using Knight's tweets as a framework upon which to hang a bit of writing. I know that responding to tweets is a rather uncharitable way of responding to someone, but they provide me with a neat starting point. I don't doubt that given a less constrained medium, Godless Spellchecker would expand on the content of his tweets in a way that wouldn't be so easy for me to respond to. The final disclaimer I will make is that I do not speak for Jordan Peterson. While his analysis of the Bible has flipped my understanding of the universe onto its head, I don't pretend to be completely conversant in all the concepts he talks about. Where there are gaps in my understanding of what Peterson says, I fill them in with my own hypotheses and analogies. So there's a wide, blurry boundary between Peterson's intended message and my own explanation of it. I hope that where I outline these gaps, I can at least be doing something to bridge the gap between the textbook Western atheist understanding, as expressed by Godless Spellchecker and my former self, and the understanding that former atheists, such as myself, now have. So, to start my actual response, I'll outline my own position. I had been a full-on atheist since the age of 6, when I first told my Catholic great-grandmother that I did not believe in God. I was always somewhat outspoken on the subject, and galvanised by Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, I got involved in skeptic atheist activism. I started Horsham Skeptics in the Pub, as well as running Brighton Skeptics in the Pub for a year. I was heavily involved in the setting up of Brighton Sunday Assembly, the atheist church, which I was very proud of indeed, and I only left that organisation after a fundamental disagreement with Sanderson-Jones over their constitution, which I felt concentrated too much power centrally, when I wanted something with a flat hierarchy along the lines of the Skeptics in the Pub movement. Anyway, I could go on for hours about all that, but I won't. During my time of involvement with the Skeptics and the atheists, I got quite a bit of press and radio coverage when I performed a brief atheist street preaching stunt, which you can see elsewhere on my channel. I also gave my own talk entitled An Atheist's Guide to the Alpha Course, 27 times at various Skeptics in the Pub groups, as well as at Conway Hall, and I gave 2 atheism or free speech themed talks at Brighton's Catalyst Club. Finally, I had a weekly column in my local paper in Horsham where I gave sceptical, non-religious takes on all sorts of topics. I was very much an atheist activist. I'm no longer an atheist, and this is mostly due to listening to Jordan Peterson's awesome biblical lectures. So I fully understand the gap between the views of the hardcore atheist and the seemingly theist views expressed by Peterson. I vividly remember hearing the first conversation between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, where the conversation got bogged down in the meaning of truth for 3 hours, much to the frustration of everybody. I remember thinking to myself that Peterson seemed to be losing the plot. I had such high hopes for that interview after following Peterson's freedom of speech campaign and the interesting hints he had given about his views on the Bible in his first Joe Rogan interview. I no longer think Peterson is mad. My conversion, for that is what it is It's best described, or the process of my conversion, or the trigger for it, was that Peterson's views on the Bible provided me with a new, believable metaphysical context in which the material world exists. Now, I had been completely content in only existing in the bubble of the material world, and I was content with not knowing why the universe existed. I was content with trying to be good for its own sake, and not just for the avoidance of hell, for instance. I was enraptured by the complexity and beauty of the universe, from the tiniest to the greatest scale, and I felt truly as if I'd won a cosmic lottery, and that my consciousness gave me something that even the heavenly bodies did not have: significance. I gave a sermon about that at the Sunday Assembly once. I was a true agnostic in that, in the absence of evidence for God, I need not live my life as if God existed. But I knew that I would change my mind if presented with new evidence. It's just that I never knew what that evidence might look like. My conception of what a conversion might feel like was pretty clumsy back when I was an atheist, and therefore not realistic. The conversion, when it happened, did not require a changing of my mind in relation to facts about the material world. It was more like taking a step back and seeing a new context in which that world made sense. As I listened to more and more of his stuff, I began to understand the terminology he was using more accurately, and this meant in turn that I could re-listen to interviews that I'd already heard and come away with a little more insight into what he was getting at. This in turn led to my being able to understand more of the concepts that had passed me by before and gradually link them all together. Peterson's worldview covers everything from the mundane to the existential, with a very well-connected set of principles. If you only focus on one dimension of it, it's quite easy to get the wrong end of the stick, such as when, in the first Harris interview, his explanation of truth came across as needlessly pedantic and obscure. After absorbing a lot of his other work, though, I could see that this definition of truth problem was more of a failure of Peterson's priorities in that conversation than it was a failure of his logic. Peterson's views of scientific objective truth are exactly the same as Harris's within the realms of the physical universe. Peterson is on the side of science in that respect. Their first interview could have moved on if Peterson had just said, "How about we continue the conversation based on the principles of empiricism as we experience them in the physical universe for a while," rather than trying to leapfrog all the way from physics to metaphysics with no steps in between. So I've touched on some of the outline as to how Peterson's views gradually came to be accepted by me, but it would take hours to try and explain that process fully, and all I wanted to do was just give a brief sketch of how I went from being a full-on atheist, very full-on atheist, to being someone who appreciates and accepts Jordan Peterson's take on the meaning of it all, basically. So anyway, I'll get back to talking about the tweets, because we can shed a bit more light on things that way, I reckon. So, Stephen Knight's first tweet in response to the Brand Peterson interview said, "Just listening to this, a lot of post hoc claims made about religious doctrine, specifically Genesis, as though it was never intended to be considered an explanation of objective reality. I find this wishy-washy, what is truth approach to be no more than highbrow obfuscation." So, I have a few points to make here. Firstly, and most harshly, I will say this. One of the traps that atheists fall into is the one where they assume that their understanding is already complete, and all too readily declare that views that differ from their own are therefore wrong, stupid, delusional, or even deceptive. Most atheists of the same vintage as Godless Spellchecker, including my former self, would consider themselves to be good skeptics, in that all hypotheses about the universe are provisional and subject to change in the light of new evidence. But they so rarely put this into practice, and instead confuse their own judgments for scientific truths. To declare that Peterson is obfuscating is to say that you believe he has deliberately acted in a way that tries to blur out the facts so that they can't be seen, because perhaps the facts would undermine his position, and it serves him better to hide them. For if people saw the raw facts, they would see through Peterson's make-believe. But just because you don't understand something, that does not justify an accusation of dishonesty. Another thing that the skeptics bang on about is the idea of taking a charitable interpretation of your opponent's views so that you can defeat their best arguments rather than the low-hanging fruit. Instead of reacting to Peterson's statement by accusing him of dishonesty, a better approach, or a more honourable approach, would be to hypothesize that perhaps you are missing something. Skeptics talk a lot about the quality of arguments, but so quickly fail to put these principles into practice when it comes to challenging their own ideas. My second response to that tweet is about Knight's claim about Genesis as if it was never intended to be considered an explanation of objective truth. This claim seems to assume that Genesis had one writer, and that that writer had the intention or knowledge that future churches would decide to teach it all as literal truth. Such simplistic ideas about the provenance of the Bible are easy to incorporate into an atheist worldview, but being so simplistic, they're effectively a straw version of reality. It's embarrassing. How about assuming the more charitable notion that the stories of Genesis evolved over time, gradually stripping away unnecessary appendages so that the central story could more effectively survive from generation to generation, like a good Dawkinsian meme, and that yes indeed, churches in their quest to spread across the world found it more effective to teach the uneducated peasants who constituted their flocks by teaching biblical stories as literally true. It seems a strange concept to us sitting here in 21st century England, where practically 100% of us can read and understand abstract concepts. But it wasn't always like that. Now, just because this strategy was effective at ensuring the spread of these beliefs, it certainly does not mean that this is still the best or the most honourable method of spreading them. If you accept that the point of these stories is to teach morals and influence behaviour, you will agree that it is not the stories themselves that are important, but their message. Now, we live in a world where people are educated. It's necessary to teach these things in a way that accepts the elevated understandings of people. We no longer need to trick people into believing these things and threaten them with literal hell. Instead, we can explain the principles involved and describe the benefits of this type of morality without having to pretend that the metaphors are real. If you accept that more charitable view, it suddenly becomes a lot harder to make glib, clumsy statements to effectively refute it. And there's a reason for that. The closer you approach a charitable reading, the closer you approach the realization that it's perfectly fine to see the world this way. People like Jordan Peterson are effectively upgrading the literary quality of the biblical texts, re-expanding them from the stripped-down, encoded form that ensured their survival, and allowing them to have an embryology, if you like, and allowing them to take a form that will be relevant in today's environment. Tweet 2. Peterson denies that religion is in conflict with science. He's wrong. Religion makes objective claims about our reality. That's a scientific claim. No amount of red herrings about archetypes and metaphors can get around that. Stephen, if you define religion as the church, the organised religion, then yes, they are often in dispute. If you define religion as the content of the holy books, it's not as readily evident that there is dispute. It is the interpretations that can be in dispute with reality. Interpretation might be that of a huge church, or it might be that of an individual such as myself or yourself. An interpretation is not suddenly more valid just because the person that dreamed it up is part of a large religion, or the founder of one. Also, it seems that the idea that there might be numerous parallel meanings at once leads to a sort of atheist knee-jerk, an atheist slamming of the clamshells. It seems wishy-washy to have numerous different ways of deriving meaning. Surely there should be just one meaning behind each story. That sounds awfully Catholic to me. Why not accept the fact that stories can express different meanings to different people, or even different meanings to the same person extended over time? This brings me to another general point about the truth of literature. It is possible for a piece of literature to be true on many different levels at once. We have all had the experience of reading a book as a teenager and loving it, and then rereading it a few years later and taking something new and completely different away from it. Between the readings, we have read other stuff and had more experiences, so that when we return to the book, we're a slightly different person, and we're able to recognise the meaning of what we could not have recognised before. Even the trivial experience of reading something for the second time allows us a new perspective on the content of the story, but one that could only come about with more than one reading. That's true for all novels, and some novels are written so that the second reading is the most satisfying one. Why can't we imagine that there are some works of literature, including the Bible, that are constructed so that the third or fourth or whatever reading bears new fruit each time? As we change, the meanings we recognise change. That's one of Peterson's claims about the Bible, that it bears potentially endless rereading due to its having evolved in a Darwinian manner. The meanings contained within it have been refined over and over again with each iteration of the stories, so that we've ended up with a tale that is as close as we can get to the true human story. That does not mean it lists a series of historical events. It means that it maps out the internal human experience against a background of billions of years where our brains and nervous systems evolved through nature. So when, for instance, atheists dismiss the Adam and Eve story as not being historically accurate, they too readily stop the analysis at that point, instead of thinking again on the possibility that there is something meaningful in there, that the story of Adam and Eve captures some essential human experience of what it was to emerge as conscious beings out of the depths of the generations of non-conscious apes that preceded us. This take on the Bible is both more symbolic and more realistic than the interpretations that mainstream religion and skeptics would have us believe. And you don't need to believe in a personal God to see these meanings. You just have to look more closely. Think of the Bible as a novel that bears critique and analysis. Do the analysis. See what you get out of it. Don't just stop when you arrive at an interpretation that matches what you already thought. That was one of the things that I noticed when I was working with skeptics in the pub, was that a lot of people would have good ideas about how to jazz up the format or how to popularise skepticism. And one of the traits of the skeptics is they're critical thinkers when it comes to finding reasons to not do something. They'll think really hard about an idea, and then they'll stop thinking as soon as they come across one reason to not do it. That's it. Having dreamt up a reason to not do something, they don't then continue until they find a reason to do it. They're lazy, but they blame their lazy conclusions on rationality. We figured it out, we thought about it, and then we found a reason to not do the thing. We found a reason to not carry on thinking because our laziness became justified by this rational process that we went through. And then they stop the process when they could just carry on thinking until they think of one reason to do the thing, another reason to do the thing. Don't stop thinking once you've matched what you already thought. Oh, it's obvious. So although you don't need to believe in a personal God to see the deeper meanings in the Bible, you can just look at it like any piece of literature. Some of us, such as myself, do go on to take that wobbly step into changing our provisional hypotheses about the nature of reality. My provisional hypothesis before had been that there was no creator God, but my provisional hypothesis has changed now to that there probably was, that I do think that there was a creative force behind the universe which is indistinguishable from the general Christian approach to what God is. And once I realised that this creative force that I believed in was indistinguishable from God, I had to be honest with myself and say that I now believe in God. If you believe in something that is indistinguishable from God, you believe in God. So finally on that tweet, I would reiterate my previous comment that the absence of agreement with yourself does not constitute grounds for a worthwhile accusation of malicious intent. Saying these things are just red herrings is to say that they are deliberate attempts to distract someone from fact. the scare quotes around the world's archetypes and metaphors just makes you sound anti-intellectual, I'm afraid. Archetypes are real, metaphors are real. Peterson invokes them in relation to relevant points that you are free to critique. That is the opposite of a red herring, the opposite of obfuscation. Next tweet. Hearing people discuss religion in such vague and abstract terms is like white noise to me. When Peterson talks about religion, he sounds very much like the postmodernists he claims to oppose. Atheists such as Stephen Knight and my former self have cut their teeth arguing against the claims of mainstream religion. This was extremely successful over the last couple of decades, but this success has led to a sort of intellectual flabbiness where the classic anti-religion arguments become the sort of trusty hammer that treats every religiously sounding idea like it's just another nail to bang in. If you listen to more than one Peterson biblical lecture, you'd have to be mad to form the conclusion that he discusses the subjects in such vague and abstract terms. Personally, I find the opposite to be the case. Peterson takes abstract ideas and connects them straight into everyday life. I think this is one of the things that he's most notably successful at. That's restoring a sense of cosmic purpose to people, so that their daily lives can be infused with meaning and significance. You can't make that link using anything other than truth. It might not be, physical scientific truth, but there are other truths. Of course, Peterson does struggle with words when we approach the edges of human understanding, as we all do, and it is in these realms that the language of symbolism takes over as the only way we can possibly begin to get to grips with it all. Unlike prophets of days of yore, or the imams or wise men of mainstream religion, you'll hear Peterson say things like, "It's something like this," or "How would you say?" Ask yourself how you would go about explaining what you know about quantum mechanics to people who don't know advanced maths. You would resort to using similes and rough examples so that the listener can use them to form a rough idea of the kind of realm we're in. These examples are necessarily wrong, of course, because quantum mechanics is not something that examples based on Newtonian physics can accurately duplicate. All pop science quantum mechanics books have to do this, otherwise they could not exist. Surely we're not saying that only ideas that can be 100% communicated with language perfectly should be expressed. No, because everyone has a different ability to understand complex concepts, but everyone wants to know as much as possible. We share this information using symbolic language in exactly the same way that all language is symbolic and imperfect. All of it. Now finally on that tweet. Deconstruction was not invented by postmodernism. There's nothing inherently wrong with breaking things right down to their constituent parts and analysing them. The problem with postmodernism is that without a definition of what constitutes good quality analysis, they validate even invalid critique as if it's just as worthy of respect as a genuine insight, and it isn't. Finally, on this tweet, everything sounds like white noise until you learn what it is that you're hearing. Next tweet. It reminds me of when I studied film at college. Two people could analyse the same film in regards to narrative, iconography, etc., and make vastly different conclusions, yet get the same grades. It's about how you argue your interpretation. Entirely subjective. Well, firstly, so what? Interpretations are subjective. We can talk about them. It's fun. Anyway, of course it is true that people can come up with an almost infinite number of interpretations. It is trivially true that two people could analyse the same film and come to different conclusions about it. I don't know what is wrong with that. Is culture not entirely made up of the expressed interpretations of the world by all sorts of people? Setting aside the triviality of the main point Gspellchecker makes here, is there a problem with there being multiple interpretations of stories? Coming from the perspective of a nerd, a perspective I relate to, whereby the power and awesomeness of science is in large part due to its ability to discern facts from non-facts. I can understand that people may feel justifiably wary when presented with a subject about which numerous explanations exist. From the scientific perspective, all the competing ideas through history have been falsified one by one, leaving us with a robust core of what you might call scientific truth. We are used to the idea that competing ideas will eventually be whittled down, but this rule simply does not apply to literary criticism in the same way. So even if there are almost infinite ways in which to interpret or understand something, which there are, that does not mean that the presence of multiple options necessarily indicates that we are looking at a set of conclusions that is 100% dodgy. For every terrible interpretation, there is a valid one. The existence of numerous terrible analyses does not mean there can't also exist numerous valid ones. One of the benefits of the fact that numerous interpretations can exist is that they will resonate with different people in different ways. Not everyone relates to an interpretation in the same way. This is why reading books is something we find interesting, as opposed to just reading the expert reviews where the true meaning is delivered to us. We want to experience the book for ourselves, find our own way through it, and learn from it in relation to our own life experiences, and maybe even pass on what we've learned in our own way to other people in a way that might affect them. Again, the existence of numerous interpretations might be a pain in the arse if you want scientific certainty in all things, but it's a great aspect of human culture. Next tweet. You can literally use this way of thinking to write a grade A paper on why Michael Bay films are akin to the best Shakespeare or Greek tragedies, also known as making crap up, basically. Using the word akin here, you seem to be equivocating between two different proposals, one ludicrous and one trivial, in order to make a low-value point. The ludicrous interpretation, or the ad absurdum interpretation in this piece of rhetoric, is the one where someone writes a grade A paper on why Michael Bay films deserve to be considered as being in the same category as Shakespeare. The other interpretation is the one where someone at the college points out valid similarities in structure, or something, perfectly valid but uninspiring like that. The ludicrous interpretation would not get an A grade because it's wrong. The trivial interpretation would not get an A grade because it's trivial. So the tweet does not stand, except as a piece of rhetoric, and only if the listener keeps both versions of this reality spinning in their head simultaneously, and it collapses as soon as you choose either interpretation. As there is no statement of any value here, the tweet serves only to display a sort of clumsy anti-intellectualism that reflects the tone of this string of tweets. Finally, on this tweet, making crap up, basically, would only get you an A grade if you had a full-on postmodernist teacher. But surely we aren't using their values to define what is meant by an A grade paper. So my point is that actually not any old interpretation will be considered valid unless you lower your standards to those of the postmodernists. But that's not what we are doing. I remember getting praise for my claims about this scene from Seven. I argued the filmmakers were giving the killer a Jesus-like aura by filming his approach as a reflection in a puddle, as though he was walking on water. Clever, eh? Also nonsense. Whereas, it's likely the filmmakers did this just to avoid revealing the identity of the killer before the third act. But that doesn't get you the marks, where interpreting iconography and metaphor is concerned. Stephen, you seem to be conflating the concept of getting the marks with the concept of writing a good piece of criticism. In education, the main reason marks are awarded is when the student demonstrates awareness, understanding, and application of certain concepts. You can get marks for showing this, even if the point that you are making is pretty weak, but that isn't the point. The point is to encourage the student to display their awareness, understanding, and application. The point you made about the filmmakers giving the killer a Jesus-like aura was not incorrect, even though you use it as an example of nonsense. But it wasn't that clever either. It was just something you noticed and your teacher decided to give you encouragement because of it. There is a difference between the concepts of iconography and metaphor in philosophy and those concepts when encountered in art criticism. I agree that looking at a Damien Hirst vomit and reading deeply about its symbolism, etc., is just post hoc rationalisation performed to make the collectors continue spending their money without their stupidity being brutally exposed. But when those concepts are discussed in the realm of philosophy, where people are being explicit about particular links between story and experience, or when novelists talk about the technical aspects of incorporating such concepts into their work, this is not the same thing. It seems as though you are implying in this tweet, where you bring up the example in the context of a pretentious film studies lecturer, that any discussion of metaphor or iconography is to be tarred with the same brush as the postmodern artists. Knowing your work, I don't think this is something you actually believe, so the tweet was no doubt just another bit of rhetoric to get your general reservations across. Fair enough. Thanks for the opportunity to express myself on the matter. On to the last tweet. In conclusion, Peterson's approach to religion could be described as a fan theory. So what, Stephen? Aren't all of our interpretations and models of the universe fan theories? Or should we not bother to think them up for ourselves in our own way and just parrot the descriptions of others that went before us? Dismissing these views as a fan theory is probably the most negative and depressing statement made in this string of tweets. I know he doesn't mean to, but Godless Spellchecker is pouring scorn on free thinking when he makes statements like this, dismissing it as a fan theory. I want a world where there are more fan theories about the meaning of it all, not fewer. We should encourage people to find their own meanings in all sorts of literature, including the Bible, because then we can all share our humble contributions to human culture, instead of just stopping our thought processes as soon as we confirm our preconceptions and prejudices. We can use empiricism and skepticism to properly keep our feet firmly grounded in reality, but we must allow ourselves the freedom to find or even create meaning beyond that. Atheists and skeptics need not be so defensive in the face of Peterson's views. His approach, his analysis, is a completely humanistic one. It's as humanistic as you can get, and it offers a rich exploration of human ideas, even to those who do not believe in a literal, personal God. The symbolism he outlines lends a significance to our own individual efforts to make the best of ourselves, and we should not allow our opinions about the stupider aspects of organised religions through history deprive us of this.